On Austin Faith Dialogue today, we're talking about the whole notion of integrating spiritual care along with medical care, a holistic approach to treating the patient. That's our topic. We're glad you joined us for Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
I'm glad you've joined us for Austin Faith Dialogue today. I'm Sandy Wilder, your host, and today our guest is Reverend Rick Ricker. And Rick, you're the chaplain at Methodist Hospital in San Antonio.
Yes, I'm one of several chaplains there, yes.
Okay, and working in a unique approach to medical care in that, as I understand, your work as chaplain, addressing people's spiritual needs, is fully integrated into the work of the medical team, working with cancer patients.
Yes.
Now, how is that unique? Because folks may not know what the standard for pastoral care is.
Well, when I came to this position 4.5 years ago, my boss gave us 3 priorities, and the first priority was to work with staff. The second priority was to work with patients and their families. And the reason is that the staff we look at it this way, that the staff are the ministers in many ways. And if we can help the staff to function better, if we can help them to be symbols of hope, of caring and compassion toward the patients, then we are carrying out the ministry of healing in the hospital. So, yes, I am part of what I guess you might call the healing team at the hospital there. I'm on what's called the oncology support team, which involves a counselor, a psychotherapist, and myself. I'm also a psychotherapist, but I function mostly as a chaplain, and as well as a case manager who helps with insurance issues, an educator who deals with issues surrounding cancer and its treatment, and other folks such as dietitians that we can bring into the picture, people that are experts in pain control, for example.
Now most folks would already know the names of some of those titles,
Yes.
and would know that they're often dietitians and patient advocates and caseworkers and such. So how is this approach then different? What happens differently at Methodist Hospital versus, say, any other hospital here in town?
Well, I guess the chaplain, I can't speak firsthand from hospitals here in town, but I can say, at least at where I work, the chaplain plays a more central role than I would guess in most hospitals in terms of being involved with the treatment of the patient. We're finding that there's more and more evidence that health is related to faith. There's been a lot of work done on this. One of the pioneers is Herbert Benson, who is a doctor who is now at Harvard University, who studies the effects of spirituality on healthcare and upon the health of individuals. There are others, another doctor named Dale Matthews, who recently has out a book called The Faith Factor, another one named Harold Koenig, that are pretty well known now for research in how faith can make a difference in a person's health. And so we're recognizing more and more, and I think that this is going to be something that's growing, that we're recognizing more and more that there's a connection between what goes on in a person and their beliefs and what happens to them physically.
So how does that then, that different understanding, that broader approach, if you will, how does that actually affect the work you do for any patient who might show up for oncology services?
Well, it took a while, but to gain the trust of the staff, to gain the trust of the physicians and the other people that are there, I am seen as a person who can be instrumental in helping people deal with their issues. I, in working in the area I work in, which is cancer, and you could name a lot of other diseases as well, that when a diagnosis comes down, it really changes a whole person's life. It changes their role as a worker, their role as a member of a family, their understanding of themselves. And I guess that's the way I define spirituality. Spirituality is the way we understand the universe and the way we see ourselves fitting into that, and that spirituality evolves with life experience and with the interpretation and reinterpretation of that experience, how it fits into our understanding of God and what life is about and our purpose in living. Mm-hmm. So when a diagnosis of a disease that is as pervasive as, for example, cancer, when that comes, then it throws a person's whole world into an upside-down basket, and all of their world just spills out on the floor. So I think there's a general understanding that the chaplain is there to help people put their life back together, to understand this experience in terms of what they believe, or even perhaps to review and to look at what they believe and to question that and to maybe grow through that.
So does that mean that you are there with the patient, and I assume the family
Yes.
too, more often or in a different kind of way than a chaplain who's not an integral part of the team is?
Yes. I mean, I am one of the first people who sees a person who is diagnosed. I'm not just brought in. I'm not just brought in if the person requests to see a chaplain. I walk in and I introduce myself, and I try to meet that person wherever they are. They may not even be religious. It does not mean they're not spiritual. It doesn't mean that they don't have a spirit. But I recognize that they have a need to understand their life in a new and different way. And that can be done through many ways. Through Scripture and through prayer, but also through the arts or through nature. Through many different ways, people can get in touch with their spirituality and find a resource there.
It sounds to me then like you bring your whole self to bear then in your work with these patients, more than you would if you were just brought in if somebody requested you.
Yes, it's not, in my role, it's not like I'm standing there waiting in the wings. I'm out actively involved and proactively involved in the treatment of the patients. I'm certainly, yes, indeed, I am brought in, especially when there's a crisis, when a person's health changes, or when if the direction of their treatment changes in a negative way, especially, I'm brought in. If there's someone having to deal with their dying or their mortality, certainly the doctors and the nurses will turn to me first. But yes, I've tried to, if I have not met those patients, if I have not followed them and known them, if I do not know their story, and their family, and have participated in their life and befriended them, then I'm not going to be able to come in and do the work that I need to do in those crisis moments.
You alluded a minute ago to the fact that plenty of people don't have any faith background, any formal faith background, and we'll get to that. But it dawns on me to wonder if people who have a faith background perhaps have a harder time with a diagnosis of cancer, in that all of a sudden everything they believed about their faith and how they should live might be thrown out the window.
Yes.
Because this dreadful thing is happening
Yes.
to them.
Yes. Yes. Sometimes it is harder on people who have a sort of an untested faith. Many of the people I see, though, are people who have been through various trials. they have experienced before, and they, if I can help them to call upon that experience in facing the changes that they faced before. Perhaps they were not as pervasive, but still they were changes like the loss of a job or the loss of a spouse. You know, there are various kinds of changes that we go through, and to review those things and see how they survived. What did they do to get through? What kinds of things were helpful to you? What kind of thinking was helpful to you? What thoughts were helpful, and what thoughts were, you know, maybe sapped energy from you? So we can review those things, and we can see what was their strength. We can also review their faith and see how their faith has helped them before in times of crisis.
And then folks who don't have a particular faith background, no tradition to call upon, how is your approach different for them, or is it?
Well, yes, it is different. Sometimes, for example, I may function more as a psychotherapist or a family counselor. I tend to try to be just as helpful to those people and to their family as I possibly can be, and show them that I'm there for them. And quite often they are already dealing with these questions about, you know, what happens if I die, or what, you know, it's amazing to me that there are people that can live to be quite old and not ever deal with their mortality. Some folks act like it's a very big surprise to find out that they could die. And so I try to help them on that level to deal with death and what they think about it, or just ask the question, tell me your thoughts if they mention they believe in God or in some in angels or whatever. Well, tell me your thoughts about that, and start to unfold that, and to see what faith is there. What some of the things are stuff that they just learned as kids, you know, and when I can say to them, you know, that stuff you learned in church when you were a kid, they may not have been back, you know, but all that stuff is true and valid, and you can call on it now.
And assuming that there might be family members around, how do you invite them to be a part of this process with the person who is actually ill?
Well, sometimes it appears to me that the family members have a harder time than the patients, because I think the patient, somehow it is happening to them, but when it's happening to someone that you love and it's not happening to you, you feel even more helpless. You want to help, but you don't know how. You want to give them health and life, but you don't know how. And it's frustrating. It's hard to watch a loved one decline in health, to watch them be sick, to watch them be nauseated, and all the nitty-gritty stuff that comes along with treatment sometimes. So yes, they need support. On Monday of this week, there was a man that came up to our floor who had been having difficulty breathing. He had treatments for head and neck cancer. One side of his face was quite swollen, distended from having lymph nodes removed, and the fluid could not drain. And now he was having trouble with his throat closing up. And the doctor, the head and neck surgeon, was called out in an emergency and was called to come to his room and to make a decision about what to do. We had to decide to put a trach in him so he could, a tracheotomy tube so he could breathe. I stood there with his wife, who had brought him to the hospital and was feeling very scared. And I just stood with her. I didn't really have much to say. And I just stood with her as the work of 6 or 8 people was going on in his room as they were preparing to take him to surgery. And as they rolled him onto the elevator, it was so crowded on the elevator there was not room for me. And I said, "I'll see you downstairs at the OR." And the doctor turned to me and he said, "You are coming?" He hadn't said a word to me before, but I knew what that meant was, I'm really glad you're here.
Yes.
And I really want you to be with her, because this is pretty scary. Something really bad could happen here.
I'm glad we've got some more time to continue the conversation. We'll be right back.
Okay.
Thank you for being with us on Austin Faith Dialogue. And stay right there. Glad you're here for the second half of Austin Faith Dialogue, when we're talking about spirituality and the healing team with Reverend Rick Ricker, one of the chaplains at the Methodist Hospital in San Antonio.
Yes.
Let's continue the conversation, Rick. Right before the break, we got to a story that illustrated so well the importance of your work, but also I heard it talking about how demanding the work is. So, Rick, how do you cope with these literal life and death situations every single day?
Well, this work is demanding on all of us, and I guess my illustration shows it's demanding on the doctors too. And the doctor needed that moral support, just knowing I was there. And God knows that the nurses and the doctors and the chaplains and everyone who's involved with this needs strength. Some days are very hard. Some days we lose people that we didn't think we were going to lose. Or there are people that are just wonderful people that we lose. Also, we get to see people get well. And, you know, the way I've come to look at it, Bernie Siegel, MD, who's a surgeon who worked on he's retired now, but he worked on a lot of cancer patients, talked about he's written several books, Love, Medicine, and Miracles, Faith, Hope, and Medicine, and he's got a lot of books out. Really good for cancer patients and anyone who works with them and their families. But he talks about the difference between being healed and being cured. He talks about healing as something that may happen without being cured, that the cure is overcoming the disease going away. But he says sometimes people are healed and not cured. Sometimes people are cured and not healed. And sometimes we're lucky to get both. You know, we do well to get both. But when he says cured and not healed, he means that people have their disease taken away, but their life is not changed. They're not a better person for it. Their family situation is not changed. Their perspective on life is not altered. But what we see so often is people, even who are dying or who are in family members of people that are not doing well, that this also brings out the best in people. It causes them to separate out what's really important in life and what's really the stuff that doesn't matter anymore. It helps them they teach us a lot and they give us a lot. And so even though some days are downer days, we get a whole lot from the patients and their families. They are so courageous. They have cut through all of the tripe that we tend to surround ourselves with in life, and they are down to being basic people dealing with the important issues in life. And that's inspirational. You brought a book with you, and I'm wondering if that's some inspiration for you in your work, and that's something that you wanted to share. Well, yes, I brought this book, The Gift of Peace by Joseph Cardinal Bernardin from Chicago. He died a couple of years ago of pancreatic cancer. But as he was dying, and he wrote this book, And it's a book about, he was accused of some abuse and how he was finally exonerated, but the stress that that caused. And then once that was worked out, then his disease showed up, pancreatic cancer, which generally is not curable. And sure enough, he did die from the disease. But he wrote this. He developed a ministry to cancer patients, and he was very honest about how his treatment was going, and he was, of course, a very public person there as Archbishop in Chicago. But he wrote these words, "In the light of my cancer ministry, I began to recognize the unique and special nature of another community to which I now belong, the community of those who suffer from cancer and other serious illnesses. Those in this community see things differently. Life takes on new, and suddenly it becomes easier to separate the essential from the peripheral." So I guess you could say that I'm very blessed to be part of a community of people who are busy about separating the essential out from the peripheral. And that's a blessing.
So given that this is such an important and such a healing ministry in the best sense of the word,
Yes.
why do you suppose that there isn't, as far as we know, a comparable kind of ministry here in one of the hospitals in Austin?
I don't know. I can't answer that. I think it is something that's coming, though. It's interesting. There's a rather controversial MD named Larry Dossey who's written some very interesting books about prayer. He was brought up as a Southern Baptist in Waco. He is still a spiritual person, but he is sort of out there. But he writes in one of his books that called Healing Words, that at the very end he says he thinks that he makes some predictions about the future, and one of the predictions is very profound. He says that he thinks that in the future that the doctor who does not prescribe prayer for his patients can possibly be sued for malpractice. He sees prayer as something, and it's not just a parochial thing, but prayer in many different forms as essential to medical treatment, and that there is so much evidence now of the power of prayer and evidence of the power of faith that this can no longer be denied. Now, when the secularization of medicine will again be overcome, I do not know in Austin, but it's coming. It'll come. This whole push that you see in Austin for holistic health, people going toward alternative medicines, all of these things, I think, are recognitions that there is something about medicine as we have practiced it that is lacking. There is something that is calling people to something beyond that understanding of human beings as machines to be fixed. We have a very different understanding of human beings. We're developing that where I work in terms of people are whole people. They're people of spirit, mind, body, and all of these things play a role in where people are in their lives, their relationships, and their health.
And that notion, that approach toward wellness makes so much sense. So how did you then get to this point? What kind of training did you need to be able to do what you're doing?
Well, after my seminary education, I worked on a doctor's degree in group dynamics, group process, and then got training for a couple of years in group psychotherapy, and then more training in psychotherapy along the way. I have some training in hospital ministry coming into this, but not a whole lot. I guess my boss, Mike Kerr, just had an intuition about me and hired me but I had a real sense when I applied for this position, having never done this full time before, that this was the place for me, and it's panned out. So I guess having training in psychotherapy, having some training in hospital ministry, and in my own life experience. In my 20s, I lost two friends. One that was my best friend in seminary. We were doing projects together during our practicum period. We were planning a youth retreat together, and that friend developed a cancer in his stomach, and in August he was dead by November, and that really tore me up. And I learned from that about how unrealistic I had been. I would try to get him to do things. The doctor said, "Oh, he's cured. He just needs to get up and walk around and move." And my friend Bob was sick and nauseated and was not doing nearly as well as the doctors seemed to think he was. And I just bought into that whole package. And Bob, he would get up and walk, but then throw up and just be so sick. And finally he just said, "You know, Rick, it's going to be okay." And he died. And it was okay for him. I mean, but I had a lot to... Another friend of mine, about 3 years later, died of leukemia, even though he had an identical twin and had a bone marrow transplant. And I would go and try to cheer him up, and instead of being with him where he was, and I would try to cheer him up, kind of like the friends of Job that came along and tried to change things instead of just being with. And I would pray for him, but he would pray for me, and his prayers were very different from mine. So I guess I learned from those friends something about this work.
And most of us are ordinary lay people without professional training in psychotherapy or pastoral care or whatever. We've got a few seconds left. Do you have some specific suggestions for us to be able to be more helpful to our friends who might be ill?
Yes. Be willing to be with them. I find that I do my best work when I lay aside everything I know and all my training, and I just go be with people. There's a little thing out of T.S. Eliot, Four Quartets, that I say to myself sometimes. It's kind of a prayer, and it's just kind of a little mantra. And it goes something like this. It says, "I said to my soul, be still, and wait without hope, for it would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love, for it would be love of the wrong thing. Faith yet remains, but the faith, the hope, and the love are all in the waiting. And do not think, for you're not ready for that."